So I'm currently rewatching Arrow, as you probably already know, but now that I've finished Season 2, I'll be ranking every episode of the season from worst to best, giving a very short review for each episode. You'll see the score I give for each episode, and by the end you'll know my favorite episode and also least favorite episode of this season, and then obviously when I finish all 7 seasons of Arrow, I'll go over the top 10 best and worst episodes of the entire show. With that in mind, let's start with this list with number 23, the worst episode of the season.
Let me help you.
Feeling unsatisfied?
The season did get a lot better, and I mean a lot better, but the first couple episodes I don't think are amazing. This episode in particular, I just found myself kind of bored for the most part, also kind of annoyed by Felicity. It does have a lot of great things about it, like Roy's storyline, Brother Blood in this episode, or Sebastian Blood in this episode is great, but for the most part, I think it is the weakest episode of this season, and even still, it's not bad, it's just okay.
I don't want to be called the Hood anymore.
So what do you want to be called?
Like I said, the season did not have an amazing start, and this episode, the first episode of the season, is very similar to the second one. It's just kind of boring, and it is a little better because Felicity is not annoying in this one while she is in episode 2, but I think this episode still, for the most part, is one of the weaker episodes of the season, which is honestly fine because I like it better if seasons start maybe not great, but then get great near the end or near the middle, which is something this season does, so it's fine that the first couple episodes aren't very good.
If I didn't know any better, I'd say you were coming to me like a jealous ex-boyfriend.
I will put you down.
This episode, I think, has one kind of thing that maybe brings it down a bit, and that's the villain, Shrapnel, who I think is pretty over the top. He's not terrible, but his storyline here is pretty boring. Other than that, however, this episode is pretty good. Nothing amazing or anything, but still relatively good. The flashback's pretty good. Laurel's storyline, investigating Blood and his aunt, who turns out to be his mother, that was really good. Probably my favorite part of the episode, and a lot of great things here or there, but overall, I think one of the weaker episodes of the season, despite being actually pretty good.
Violent psychopaths, killers.
What happens in Russia stays in Russia.
This episode, again, pretty good despite being fairly low on the list. Team Arrow, or Oliver, Felicity, and Diggle, along with Isabel, go to Russia to rescue Lila. Turns out they end up teaming up with Deadshot, which is all a lot of fun. Again, it's still pretty good despite being low on the list. The reason it is as low on the list as it is, even though it's kind of fun, and Deadshot is pretty great, I just don't think there's anything else enough to put it any higher. Again, still pretty good, but just, fairly low on the list, and one of the worst or weaker episodes of the season.
Nice mask.
You shouldn't have come here.
Dollmaker, the villain of this episode, is probably the creepiest villain the Arrowverse has ever had. He's just so creepy, and I think that this episode definitely is enhanced by that because it has a pretty great villain. Not to mention, I think the rivalry between Dollmaker and Quentin is actually pretty good. I also think that the flashbacks are pretty good, the trial scenes are pretty good, and the conclusion to Laurel's hatred of the Arrow storyline in this episode, it all works very well. It's just that there's nothing really amazing aside from that to make it any higher on the list. It's kind of difficult ranking every episode when they're all really good, or they're all at least pretty good, when some episodes that I like a lot, like this one, are very low on the list.
Step aside or get put down.
You're in real danger.
There's only one way that you leave the leak.
This episode saw the introduction of the League of Assassins, as per the title of the episode, which was pretty cool. I think also the storyline of Quentin learning that Sarah was alive, that was handled very, very well, and actually was slightly emotional, and I think the flashbacks are fine, not great. I mean, the fact that it doesn't focus on Oliver Queen and all the characters from the island, that is maybe why the flashbacks are not really as good as usual, but I think they were necessary, and I'm glad they were there. All in all, a pretty good episode.
I
will put you down.
This episode I thought was really great. I didn't love the flashbacks. I felt the flashbacks were needlessly making Laurel a worse person for no reason. I felt like the present day, however, those were really good, with Laurel and Oliver tracking down who Brother Blood is. That worked so well, especially since Laurel was right. I mean, I thought the present day made Laurel a much better character than she was maybe in the season up until this point. I also really like Roy's storyline, so overall, another great episode, or at least, good episode in the season.
Tell me where my wife is! If half of the stories that I have heard about Ra's al Ghul's daughter are true, we will all pay.
This episode definitely focused a lot on the Lances in the present day and in the flashbacks, and while in this season, going through the season, I never really liked the flashbacks nearly as much if they weren't focusing on the island or on Oliver Queen. This one, while not an exception, was actually not bad, as they did show another perspective to the Queen's Gambit being sunk, especially in terms of them learning that Sarah was with them, so that worked fine, but also the present day, it was all good, nothing amazing, nothing terrible. It was all really just good, making it, at this point in the list, pretty much equal to every episode we've gone over so far, or at least a little better.
If they're wearing a mask, they get a bullet.
Oh, I sure does like to dress up as girls.
The main storyline of this episode with the titular Birds of Prey, but it's really just a Huntress, also Black Canaries there, kind of a little bit. I mean, it's just a very loose version of the Birds of Prey. It's a fun storyline, but also very well acted by Huntress's actress, and I do think that she was pretty good in this episode as a villain, and then in the end of the episode, a more sympathetic character, but I think this episode really shines in its flashbacks, which are pretty amazing, and this episode probably would have been a lot lower without the flashbacks, or if they were not as good, but they are really good. The flashbacks in this season, especially at this point in the season, are amazing, so because of that, this episode is at this point on the list.
Could I say something funny?
Is that blood on your face?
Who taught you to shave?
This episode is just all around pretty good. The villain, the mayor, I don't think is great, but literally everything else is really good, especially the ending revealing that Sebastian Blood is Brother Blood, which you were able to tell. I mean, it was obvious based off the fact that that is who he is in the comics, but it was a cool reveal nonetheless, just for the structure of the season. I liked basically everything in this episode. The flashbacks, while not the best flashbacks of the season, by a long shot, they are still really good. So overall, yet another good episode.
I'm Count Vertigo, and I approve this high.
What do we do now?
We shut him down.
This episode was the finale to the Moiron trial storyline, which honestly I thought was a really good storyline, and this was a very good finale to that. It was a very intense episode for the most part, very satisfying ending to it, with also the reveal that Malcolm Merlyn is still alive, definitely being something that you wouldn't really see coming, even though I do think that in the long run, maybe they shouldn't have done that, maybe they shouldn't have brought him back from the dead, they should have just let him stay dead. I do think that it was still a cool reveal in this episode, not to mention the flashbacks are pretty good, and the storyline with Count Vertigo is also really good as well. And the rivalry between Oliver Queen and Count Vertigo, who now knows that the Arrow is Oliver Queen, it's really good. Overall, I think a great episode. This episode is weird because I love so much of it, but then I really hate one part of it. The storyline of Felicity being jealous of Sarah, it's so bad that it ruins this episode a little bit. It makes it so this episode is not in the top 10 because everything else in this episode is great. The flashbacks aren't amazing, but they're good. Clocking is a great villain. The storyline with Laurel being angry at Sarah and how Oliver gets involved, and that those scenes, they're so well acted and so well written. The chemistry is so good between those two actors. It works so well, and not to mention obviously the ending of Slade showing up in the Queen Mansion. It's just so good that it sucks that this episode is at least a little bit ruined by Felicity Smoke, because this easily could have been in the top 10, but it isn't.
You have no idea what it is you're dealing with. Oh yeah. We're just getting started.
This episode is, again, really good. The storyline with Roy I thought was so good, and the moment where Oliver reveals his identity to Roy, it's such a great moment, probably the best moment of this episode, and definitely a great moment. The flashbacks in this episode are just top-notch. They're so damn good, and everything else in this episode, none of it's bad, none of it's amazing like everything else, but none of it is necessarily bad. It's all really good, making this episode almost in the top 10.
Everyone's gonna find out Oliver's the vigilante.
We can't save him.
But I know someone who can.
Barry, Alan, crime scene investigation.
This two-parter, episode 8 and 9, successfully was a backdoor pilot to The Flash, which is a great show with a great main character. And this show saw the introduction to that character. This episode saw the introduction of that character, Barry Allen, who would later become The Flash. Had such a great introduction in this episode. This episode just has to be at least this high on the list and has to be a great episode. And I did like, even outside of Barry Allen's introduction, I did really like a lot of this episode, including the flashbacks, which are pretty damn good, making this episode at the bottom of the top 10.
You and Slade.
The essence of heroism is to die so that other people can live.
This city needs the arrow.
I'm the arrow.
This episode just had so many things going for it. I mean, the ending, the last couple episodes of the season, like episodes 18 to 23, it's just a roller coaster of amazing episodes. And while out of those episodes, this one is technically the worst, it is still really good and has so many great things going for it. The aftermath of Moira's death, which is pretty emotional. The flashbacks, which are pretty great. The investigation of Brother Blood, Sebastian Blood, learning that he is working for Slade, and Laurel revealing to Oliver that she knows who he is, or both of them are, Brother Blood, as well as the Arrow. It all works so well, making a great episode and a great third to last episode of the season.
Bingo. Stop me if you're shooting me right now.
Honor. I know exactly how this brotherhood works.
This episode saw the introduction of the titular Suicide Squad, and especially with how tied their hands were in creating this team, they just did such a great job, especially with Deadshot. This episode did an incredible job at humanizing him, making him more three-dimensional, more sympathetic, and more of an anti-hero, and it did such a great job at that. Not to mention that the actual mission, the actual episode Suicide Squad mission, was just so much fun. The storyline with Oliver and Sarah was pretty good, not amazing, but pretty good in the flashbacks. Again, I prefer flashbacks in the season that do focus on Oliver Queen, but I do appreciate these, and I think they were also pretty good. Overall, this episode is a very good one, and even, I would say, great.
Save the city.
You have no idea how dangerous it is out here. The city is falling.
Find him.
The penultimate episode of the season is just such a great one. Like I said, the last couple episodes of the season, they're just so good, and this one is no exception. The Sebastian Blood storyline in this episode was handled really well. The action and how climactic this episode, the last couple episodes of the season work and how they feel, it's so damn good, making this definitely one of the best episodes of the season.
Where's Thea?
What are you gonna do? Kill me?
Like I said, the climax of this season, the ending of the season, is so damn good, and this episode is absolutely no exception. Manu Bennett is so good as Deathstroke, and the last 6 episodes of this list, he's in all of them. He has a huge part in all of them. I'm gonna mention him in every single one of them, as he's such a great Slade Wilson, but also the whole storyline, it's really intense. It's all so damn good, and also in the end, Laurel learning that Oliver is the Arrow, the flashbacks, even Isabel Rocha being revealed to work for Slade, it all works so well. My only really one problem with the episode is the misdirect of Oliver's secret where Thea is involved. I didn't like that. I thought it was unnecessary, and I didn't like how they explained that Oliver never told Thea that he literally just found out that Malcolm is her mother like a couple weeks ago. But other than that, I thought this episode was practically perfect and certainly one of the best of the season. And another episode from near the end of the season. It's so damn good. Manu Bennett again, amazing as Slade, and Slade's storyline in this episode is also really good. But that fight scene when Slade goes to the bunker or to the Arrow Cave to get the skeleton key, that fight scene is maybe the best fight scene in this season and one of the best fight scenes on the show. It's so good. It's just so fast-paced, so well choreographed, and definitely the highlight of the episode, but definitely not the only highlight. This episode has so many damn amazing moments. Quentin's storyline, Quentin in the end saying that he doesn't want to know who the man under the hood, also Laurel figuring out who the fact that Sarah is the canary, it's so damn good. Obviously the flashbacks are really good as well, making this yet another amazing episode from near the end of the season.
You are done. When I say you're done.
The season finale is the highest rated episode of the season on IMDb, and it is often said to be the best episode of the season, but I don't think it is. The Illicity stuff, I just can't get past it. I was maybe able to when it first came out, because I didn't really have much of a problem with Illicity, or at least as much, and also, it was only season 2, but now that that whole thing is stuck around the entire show, things like this, in this episode especially, definitely bother me, but literally everything else in this episode is just so amazing. First of all, the flashbacks, incredible. The Suicide Squad's side storyline is pretty damn good. The main storyline with Deathstroke, obviously the rivalry between Oliver and Deathstroke coming to a head in this episode, it all works so well. It's also the parallel between the flashbacks and the present day, which is something that they really never do again until the season finale of season 5, but even then, it's not as parallel. It just works so well in this episode, making this episode certainly one of the best episodes of this season, but not quite at number 1.
I'm not gonna let that happen.
No one dies tonight. Back down!
You should kill me.
Now this episode, for the most part was pretty good. The Roy storyline was good, everything to do with Moira was good, and her revealing to Oliver that she knows that he is the Arrow, that was pretty awesome. But for the most part, a pretty good episode, that is until the ending, when the episode became one of the best episodes of the season, and even one of the best episodes of the show, as the last couple minutes are some of the most intense moments in the entirety of the show, with Slade giving Oliver a very similar choice to what he had on the island during the mid-season finale. Flashbacks between Shadow and Sarah, this time between Thea and Moira. It's such an intense moment. It's incredibly well acted, incredibly well written, and everything they do here is amazing. And then Moira's death is incredibly emotional. I always say that Tommy's death is the most emotional death in the Arrowverse for me, but Moira's is very close, especially with how they build it up in the episode. This episode is very focused around Moira in the present day and in the flashbacks. And again, I don't really love the flashbacks as much if they're not focusing around the island in this season, but I think those were 100% necessary to build up to make Moira's death a lot more emotional than I think it could have been, and all of that makes this one of the best episodes of the season and one of the best episodes of the show.
It's like he's not human. He's human. Well, then you can kill him.
It's time you joined me.
The second part of the Barry Allen two-parter and the mid-season finale, this episode is legitimately incredible. It's just moment after moment after moment of so many amazing things, especially in the last quarter of the episode, with Shadow's death being incredibly emotional, so much more emotional than it had any right being, incredibly intense. It's Moira's death, it's not as emotional or intense, but this episode has a lot more than just that, but it is definitely both of those things. There's also Tommy's ghost scene, which is such a great scene. They bringing Tommy back in any episode brings a level of emotion that nothing else from the show really can give, except for maybe Moira as well, but I think that made that scene amazing. Slade's speech is incredible. Barry being hit by lightning is one of the most chilling moments on the show, especially when it first came out. I remember when this episode first came out, Barry being hit by lightning, I got chills. It was such an amazing moment, and it got me so excited for the upcoming Flash TV show, not to mention Oliver getting his mask is awesome. It's just moment after moment after moment in this episode that just works so well, and there's a lot of great moments and also just storylines in this episode that I didn't even mention, but overall this episode I think is perfect.
No chances, no mistakes.
doing, Mr. Quaid? You look a little peaked.
Before I rewatched this season, I did not know I loved this episode as much as I did. I thought I really liked it, but it wasn't my favorite episode of the season. That is until I rewatched the season, and this episode is incredible. The present day storyline has some of the most intense moments ever, with Slade just standing there, with walking around Queen's mansion, and Oliver knowing what he's planning, what he's trying to do, and in the end Slade saying to Oliver that he has come here to fulfill his promise. It's incredibly intense. It's basically like the entirety of every single scene. It's intense moment after intense moment. But this episode is the flashback episode of the season. Who knew that the flashback episode would be as good as it is? Not even that, but the best episode of the season, at least in my opinion. But that is, I think, the case, as the flashbacks are incredible. They're so damn good. It's like a whole movie of flashbacks in this episode. It's very cinematic. It's incredibly well acted, and it's also very well written, and it's all so epic, making this my favorite episode of the season, one of my favorite episodes of the show, and a perfect 10 out of 10. So anyway, that is my ranking for all 23 episodes of The Flash. That is my ranking for all 23 episodes of Arrow Season 2. If you haven't seen my Arrow Season 1 video, definitely check that out. And also, all 5 seasons of The Flash, I ranked all the episodes, so definitely check that out as well. But if you like this video, make sure to leave a like, share, and subscribe. And definitely stay tuned for my ranking of Season 3 and then Season 4.